deviant than women are. What do you think of that one? No, I don't think so either. Like I said, men occupy more positions of power in the social hierarchy. That seems kind of reasonable. In terms of the sex and infidelity offenses, basic biology might tell us men are less choosy, if I could use maybe not the right word, but when it comes to selecting their sex partners, okay? Or men are viewed as sometimes more violent and aggressive, so maybe that has something to do with it, but I'm speaking beyond my depth a little bit. I'll leave that to the biology people across campus. In terms of strategies by offense, we have some that I've listed before: sex, infidelity, violence, inappropriate speech, etc. One thing that was interesting to me is that those accused of violent crimes, what they would generally do is they'd use provocation as their primary strategy. So if they were assaulted somebody or whatnot, they would say, I was provoked into doing that. Okay, here's an example of somebody that did that. Dr. Dre was interviewed for a television program. He thought the television interviewer, Denise Barnes, did not portray his musical group, NWA, in a very positive light. So he assaulted her physically. And here's his, yeah, and not verbally, physically. So he says, here's what he said: people talk all the dang time, but you know, somebody messes with me, I'm going to mess with them. Besides, it ain't no big thing. I just threw her through a door. Okay? I think provocation probably works well in this situation. I mean, what would be the alternative? You could say, well, it wasn't a very hard door, or it was an accident. No, provocation's probably, you know, you fight violence with violence, so I don't know, like or some kind of provocation there. When we also looked at gender and offense, we found that men are engaged in sex or infidelity more frequently than women. Okay? Here's an example of a man that okay, we don't have audio.
Those people that I have offended, I want to say to them, I'm deeply sorry about that, and I apologize.
Okay, so men are, maybe men are pigs, I don't know. But Arnold's a good example of a representative of that. Okay, then we have, this was a shocking one to me. Women were much more violent than men. So men, now you have an argument, okay? Not a very good one. It's the only one I can give you probably out of this presentation where you look better than the women do. But it might be a misleading statistic because we have people like Naomi Campbell who threw a phone at her maid. We have Tanya Harding in there for clubbing Nancy Kerrigan. We have Serena Williams in there. Here's an example of Serena. Did you know she got in trouble yesterday for screaming at the ump? This one was from a year before when she threatened to shove a tennis ball down the throat of the line judge at the U.S. Open. And here's what she says.
What would you like to say to her if you do have the chance? You mentioned you haven't had the opportunity.
I would like to give her a big old hug and let her know that I'm just, you know, just put it all behind us like, you know, I have, and move on from it, and just, I mean, I have, and just, you know, like I said, learn.
She's so sweet, isn't she? She wants to give her a big old hug, you know, and put it behind him. After that interview, she would later deny that she threatened to kill her, okay? Which I think raises a really interesting argument. Could you shove a tennis ball down somebody's throat without actually killing them? I guess it's all semantics, you know, it's language, and that's too complicated for me. Another example is political figures engaged in sex or infidelity more than any other offense. What might you expect political figures to be engaged in? I would think it's probably deception, but it ended up being sex or infidelity, which tells me something. It tells me that possibly political figures are more worried about lying to their constituents than to their wives, maybe. I'm not sure. But it is interesting that deception and sex or infidelity were the primary ones. Organizations varied. They were all over the place in terms of types of offenses. Celebrities were most often engaged in inappropriate comments. Here you have an example of John Lennon talking about a comment that he made where he said, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus Christ.
More to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here, saying that we're better or greater, or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person, or God as a thing, or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong, or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
Okay, so that's a good example of a celebrity engaged in trouble. Sports figures, violence 29%, deception 28%. I should clarify that deception includes the steroid stuff, even though you might classify that as drugs, but when we were coding, we felt that the offense was more related to the fact that they cheated than the fact that they ingested a drug. So we coded it as that, so that's why you see the deception there. Religious leaders engaged most often in sex or infidelity than any other kind of offense. Does that mean that that is their primary offense? Not necessarily. I think the media might cover those kinds of offenses more frequently because of the hypocrisy associated with being a religious figure and engaged in sex, etc. Media was most engaged in deception or fraud. So these are people like Stephen Glass, who fabricated stories, Jason Blair stories, and then Dan Rather, who got some misinformation when he did a story on Bush's National Guard service. Okay. In terms of media and deception, I don't know if you recall this, but in 1994, Time came out with this cover of O.J. Simpson that was a little darker than the Newsweek cover. So people said, that's racist. You made him look darker and more sinister. And so James R. Gaines from Time magazine offered this explanation. He said, first, it should be said, and I wish it went without saying, that no racial implication was intended by Time or by the artist. One could argue that it's racist to say that blacker is more sinister, but that does not excuse insensitivity. So one of the things I want to talk about now is how do people use mortification? And mortification is the primary strategy, right? 54% of all apologetic statements were taking responsibility. When I was working on my dissertation, I noticed that my wife always tells me, don't go too deep in your dissertation because it'll put people to sleep. But I studied how the United States and the Soviet Union interacted during the 1960 spy plane incident, how the U.S. apologized to the Soviets. Okay? And one thing I noticed was they were saying things like, we regret that this incident occurred. Okay? Which is not the same as saying, we're sorry, you know. And so I thought that this was ripe for further development. So that's what Dr. Barton and I were trying to do is further flesh out this category of mortification. Okay? So people take responsibility 54% of the time. Words used are typically apology and sorry, which is not earth-shattering. But they also used a bunch of other words. And you can see some of the choices here. So they're all over the map in terms of the words that they use to describe them. Okay? So there really is a continuum of strong to weak words. If you are a drunk driver and you hit somebody's toddler because of your irresponsible behavior, you're not going to say, I'm sorry, I screwed up. You know, that's not strong enough. Or if you cheated on your taxes, you're not going to say, I have sinned against mankind. I mean, that's a little over the top. So keep in mind that these words all have different connotations and different levels of strength. But one of the common mortification strategies was to emphasize the harm that was caused. Here, Jim Baker was accused of defrauding members of his congregation out of a lot of money. He says, my heart was crushed to think I led so many people astray. I was deeply grateful that God had not struck me dead as a false prophet. So he's not only saying I'm responsible, he's emphasizing the damage by saying, this is so harmful, God could strike me down for this. That's how bad this is, the thing that I did. Or you could use slightly less elevated language like Charles Barkley after his DUI, where he said, I embarrassed everyone in my life, and that is not cool at all, which I like that one. Sometimes what they do is they'd push forgiveness or ask for forgiveness, which is an interesting one to me because who decides when you're forgiven? Do you get to decide that? It's the person that you offended. And so sometimes they'll do things like Bob Packwood does here when he was accused of sexually assaulting some of the women that worked in his office. He says, am I sorry? Of course. If I did the things that they say I did, then I'm sorry. Do I apologize? Yes, but it's time to get on and not look back. That doesn't fly very well because people are like, don't tell me when to move on. That's my decision. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll say there is no excuse or no justification. This example is Elder Henry B. Eyring, first counselor in the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's apologizing for the Mountain Meadows massacre that occurred just south of here, and here's what he had to say.
Here long ago by members of our church